I feel like off-brand Souls games can be a hit or miss. They'll either be really good or just mid. So usually I'm optimistic when Souls games from other developers release. But as a fan of the genre, I'm open arms with these games. Because sometimes other developers have interesting takes on the genre. Whether it's a From Software game or another developer taking a stab at the genre, I'm all for it. Lords of the Fallen is a dark fantasy Souls-like game, developed by Hexworks and published by CI Games. Lords of the Fallen is also Hexworks' first game. This Lords of the Fallen is a reboot / sequel to the 2014 game. The game is set in the same universe, but this time being an Unreal Engine 5 game. For the game's premise, an evil god named Adir, who used to rule over humanity, was banished into the Umbral world. In his hunger for vengeance, Adir orchestrated an army of demons to bring chaos and set himself free. It is the Dark Crusader's duty to ensure that Adir doesn't resurrect. Now you obtain this Umbral lamp by pure fate, because the Dark Crusader before you was being hunted by this Light Reaper. Before that Crusader's death, he tossed the lamp in a hole filled with corpses, and now the lamp is in your possession. And from there, the game starts. After you complete the tutorial and then beat the first boss, you're then tasked to light these beacons spread across the world in order to prevent Adir's return, and from there you're on your own. Now to be honest, the concept of jumping between two worlds is pretty cool. Using the lamp in-game allows you to find or open up hidden pathways, or even find secret loot, but mostly used for exploration. Now when you get into the Umbral world, you lose half your health immediately, also called withered health. You also get withered health when you block enemy attacks. You can regain that health back by delivering some hits on enemies. And also the Umbral world can be treated as a second life in a way, because when you die in the living world, you're immediately transported into the Umbral world. And this is really convenient for boss fights, especially when you're so close to beating a boss. The Umbral world also has its own set of enemies to fight, and the longer you stay in the Umbral world, the more enemies spawn around you. To get back into the living world, you either have to rest on the vestiges, this game's version of bonfires, or these statues that can be found across the world. While I'm talking about vestiges, the game has a very useful item called vestige seeds. Sometimes across the game's world there are these flower beds. With these flower beds you can plant a vestige seed, and you'll have yourself a temporary bonfire. Or vestige, sorry. Yeah, no matter what game it is, I always call them bonfires. These seeds will stay active until you plant another one somewhere else. Now, only time you should use a vestige seed is if the distance between the other vestige is too far, or you're near the boss room and don't want to run the distance. Before getting into the gameplay, I do want to say, they did a really good job on the visual presentation of the game. I think the graphics and art direction is really good. Atmosphere is great. Lighting is also good. And they also did a good job with the music. Now diving into the gameplay itself, which is the most important part, I already went over the Umbral world mechanics, but now I want to go over the combat and movement. You have your standard light attack and heavy attack that you can also mix up a little. Like you can do a light attack and follow that up with a heavy attack and back to a light attack. You know, R1, R2, and then R1. You can charge up heavy attacks. You can also switch between stances. Like you can fight one-handed and switch between two-handed mid-combat. Which is cool how flexible it is. But you'll most likely forget that you can do this in combat. Also, when you lock onto enemies, they have this little circle meter, which indicates the enemy's posture. You can deplete the enemy's posture meter by mostly heavy attacks, or by parrying their attacks. Once you deplete their meter, their circle turns red, and you'll be able to perform a execution move on them that deals them heavy damage or just kills them. Parrying seems to feel different depending on what your left-handed weapon is. Like if you have a shield, I find parrying to be a lot easier compared to just using one weapon or dual wielding a weapon. You can also kick enemies, and if you kick them enough, you'll be able to perform that execution move. It takes a while though. The Umbral lamp can also be used during combat. You can use the lamp to separate an enemy's soul into two that actually slows them down, giving you an opening for attacks. You'll also come across enemies and bosses that have this blue umbral entity flying next to them. This entity either offers them healing or just makes them where they can't be damaged at all until you deal with it. These can be annoying to deal with. Also because enemies are mostly in groups, so dealing with that blue fly can be difficult. As for the enemies in this game, there's really not that much enemy variety. At first, it seems like each area has its own set of enemies, but the further you get into the game, you realize you're fighting the previous enemies you just faced but with more HP. They become more dense the further you go. It comes to the point where I'm better off just running past everyone. But if you feel the need to level up your character, then you're gonna have to find an area of enemies to farm from. I also feel like the enemy placement in this game just isn't good. Sometimes enemies just appear out of nowhere, or you're dealing with a group of tough enemies. I feel like elite enemies are just placed too close to each other, and since they have a lot of HP, fighting them just isn't worth it sometimes. There are areas where you have two tough enemies with a group of standard enemies, along with ranged enemies, and it's even worse if you're in the Umbral world because you might find yourself fighting about 10 to 12 enemies, maybe more, at the same time. Because in the Umbral world, these ghouls or zombies can infinitely spawn. Also, ranged enemies just seem to have a really good lock on you. Like their shots are just way too accurate. Another thing about facing these groups of enemies is the camera lock on. The camera tends to lock on to something else that I wasn't intending to lock onto, whether it's enemies or an objective. Like sometimes in the Umbral world, you have to lock onto these egg things in order to progress, and the camera will just not lock onto it. Sometimes it'll lock onto the enemies instead. Again, while you're facing groups of enemies, it can be frustrating to deal with. You can't seem to lock onto the enemy you specifically want to fight first. So yeah, the targeting system in the game sucks, both for exploration and combat. Also, I find the movement in the game to feel a bit more restrictive when you lock onto an enemy, really when it comes to dodging, which can be an issue because movement in a game like this is important. As for boss encounters, I think the main bosses you face are okay, but the other bosses you come across, I kind of find them a bit underwhelming. I don't know, I just think some of these boss fights are a little hit or miss. They're either going to be too easy or just unfair. That's just how I feel about the bosses. NPC side quests are a bit cryptic. For weapons, I think there's a nice variety of weapons to pick from. Dual wielding can be fun. You have a nice selection of armor customization to pick from. Throughout the game, you'll collect these maps, but these so-called maps you receive just aren't helpful at all. They just hint you on the area you're supposed to go, and in your first playthrough, you'll find yourself lost a lot. Honestly, these shouldn't even be a feature in the game at all, given the fact that it just doesn't help you in any way. It feels more like a scrapbook than a map. Some final thoughts I do want to share. As I mentioned earlier, the game's visuals are gorgeous, concepts this game introduces are also good. I really admire the scale of the game's world. And something I've realized, I think you can visit all 5 beacons on foot without running into a single loading screen, unless you fast travel, which I admire. But I also want to go over some things that I didn't like about the game, like the amount of enemies you have to face. Some enemies having Umbral wisps protecting them. When you're in Umbral world, there are these Reapers that come in by surprise. Now, they don't just appear when they want, I think it's only in some areas. Going up against ranged enemies along with standard enemies at the same time was not fun. So earlier I mentioned how vestige seeds allow you to make temporary resting points. Well, I didn't mention how these were placed in game. Sometimes these flower beds are placed very close to the main checkpoints, where I'm running across these areas for periods of time. No checkpoints to be seen, but I see flower beds around me, so I decide to utilize them. But I've had moments where I slapped myself in the face for using a precious vestige seed on a flower bed, and literal seconds later I run into a vestige checkpoint not even that far from the flower bed that I just wasted my seed on. Now, seeds aren't that rare. You can actually buy them from the NPCs, and the idea of having these seeds being like your own spawn point is cool. But some of these flower beds are just placed too close to the main checkpoints. Like, there's no reason for them to be so close to each other. I personally enjoyed the combat mechanics. It's just a camera lock on that I have an issue with when it comes to combat. And dodging can feel janky sometimes. Finally, I want to add that I wasn't able to play the multiplayer part of the game because it just didn't work for me at all. To close off, there is a good game in here, but there are some flaws with it. I feel like when you get to the halfway point of the game, you'll start to notice more and more flaws that this game has. For me though, I just powered through it. Though I will say I do have a bit of mixed feelings about this game. I can't decide if I like it or dislike it. There were many moments in this game that I feel like this could have been done better. The game does have its qualities, but it also has its flaws. During the time I was playing, the devs did release a patch like every day, so they do seem to care about the game. It's highly possible that many of the issues that this game has will be improved or fixed in the future, if not already fixed as of this going out. So I am taking into consideration that issues like camera lock-on and enemy density have been improved as of this video going out. And if that's the case, then I'd recommend waiting a bit. I felt like I should mention that. I do think this game does have some redeeming qualities that needs improvement. If the devs decide to make a sequel, I hope they take the criticism they receive seriously, because I do see some potential for Lords of the Fallen. I really do like the ideas introduced here. I don't know if I recommend the game though, especially for the average gamer. If you're a Souls-like fan, you might enjoy it. I don't know, level design and enemy placement is not that great. Personally, given how mixed this game was received, I would wait for a sale.